Why are you here, first and foremost?
I could be the most relevant person at this conference.
I secretly think you're a Bitcoiner.
I asked the people to look around this conference. I've never been to a conference this big. 30,000 people who are here, who are completely confident that they can't lose, and Bitcoin's got no place to go but up. To ask themselves, okay, here I am at this huge conference with this massive exhibit hall, with all this money being spent on all these high-tech booths. Do I think I'm early or am I late? This might be the peak of the mania. And, we've got the government in here. We've got Vice President was here. Donald Trump as a candidate spoke at the conference last year, but now we've got all these senators and we've got state governments buying Bitcoin, government buying Bitcoin. To me, it seems like that's the end of it.
Only 5% of the world owns Bitcoin. Isn't that pretty early?
That's a lot.
Everybody in the world has heard gold. Does that mean gold peaked?
The last thing we need is a Bitcoin standard, but we should go back to a gold standard. But
why not a Bitcoin standard?
Because Bitcoin is nothing. This bracelet here is probably about $20,000 worth of gold. It's melted down.
But what about the Bitcoin here?
Now the government is going to take my money and buy Bitcoin.
They said they won't.
Well, if you price Bitcoin in gold, despite all the hype and all the the political backing and all the NFTs and the strategic reserves and all this, Bitcoin today, as we're at this conference, is about 10% lower than it was at its peak in 2021, priced in gold. People are saying, how can all 30,000 of us are right and you're wrong, right? Well, because it's a Bitcoin conference, right? I mean, if it was an idiot conference, right? Yes, all the idiots would be wrong. The Chinese are smart. The Americans are dumb.
They also don't believe.
Not all.
We're at the Bitcoin Las Vegas conference, and joining us right now is somebody who you may not expect to be at a premier Bitcoin conference, someone who has been very critical of the entire Bitcoin space for a very long time and still is. Peter Schiff, chairman of Euro-Pacific, CIO rather, of Euro-Pacific Asset Management, and the president of Schiff Gold. Peter, I'm joined by my co-host, Bonnie Chang. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, just to follow up on my introduction, you tweeted this. I'm going to show you and the audience just a few seconds of you tweeting this from your booth.
I'm here at this exhibit hall from the Bitcoin conference setting up the Euro-Pacific Asset Management booth. But it really is amazing the size of this exhibit hall and all of the companies that are exhibiting really high-tech stuff. Very expensive booths. It's a massive conference. I mean, this is way bigger, I think, than the Mortgage Bankers Conference I came to in 2006 here in Vegas, as far as the amount of money that's being spent by the exhibitors. They have much fancier booths. I remember I was laughing at all the booths at the mortgage conference. They had like subprime, we'll finance anybody, even if you just got out of prison, no problem, we'll get you nothing down, no doc mortgage, and that was really the peak of the insanity. And, this is certainly like peak insanity here. And this is before anybody even arrives, but it's just amazing what a complete waste of money and resources. Everything on nothing, all of this being spent on companies that produce nothing, provide no real value, and just allow people to gamble on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I mean, obviously it makes sense that this conference is taking place in Las Vegas. In fact, they ought to have, in the, casinos where they have blackjack and roulette and, craps, they ought to have little tables where you can trade Bitcoin. At least you could get drinks served to you by pretty girls. It might be a better way to gamble. Anyway, that's it for now, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, so and then you went on to say the entire industry is insane. There's just so much money being spent here. It's crazy. It's a big bubble. You've compared it to the mortgage conference that you attended in 2006, right before the mortgage, MBS security crash in 2008. Is that what's happening right now? Why are you here, first and foremost?
Well, a lot of people ask me that question as they're asking me to pose for a selfie with them. But, I know from experience, because almost everybody that comes up to me says the same thing. You're the reason I own Bitcoin. And now, that was not my intention. Right? I'm not proud of the fact that I've converted more people to Bitcoin than any other human being alive. But the reality is I have. So I'm the big Bitcoiner because I am the one that really got people to Bitcoin, mainly because I got them to understand economics, Austrian economics, sound money, gold. And they just went, a bit too far and went past where I brought them and ended up at Bitcoin. Now, they've made money. I mean, that wasn't, my intention, but they ended up buying Bitcoin. And if they sold it today, they'd obviously make a lot of money. The problem is they're not selling, they're buying more. And every time I tell people not to buy Bitcoin, they go and buy more Bitcoin. And so I've got this unintended consequence, like a government program. Right? It does the opposite of what I intend. But I think I'm people who are in Bitcoin. They know me. Either they got into it because of me, or they just read my stuff, or they know that I'm anti-Bitcoin. But so I could be the most relevant person at this conference to Bitcoin, because everybody else is just an echo chamber. Everybody else just says, yeah, Bitcoin's great. Bitcoin's going to the moon. I mean, who the hell needs to come to a conference to hear that? And it's more like just a giant party, right? For people to just celebrate, how much money they have. But, I asked people when I did my panel today, because I think, it's just based on the greater fool theory, and people buy Bitcoin because they expect to sell it at a higher price. And the people who buy it from them have the same expectation to be able to sell it at a higher price. And so, like all pyramids or Ponzi schemes, the people who get in early make a lot of money, but they make a lot of money because the people who come in late lose that money, and it's just a transfer. So I asked the people to look around this conference. I've never been to a conference this big. 30,000 people who are here, who are completely confident that they can't lose, and Bitcoin's got no place to go but up, to ask themselves, okay, here I am at this huge conference with this massive exhibit hall, with all this money being spent on all these high-tech booths. Do I think I'm early or am I late? Because to me, nobody at this conference who's buying Bitcoin is getting in early. Now, is this conference going to get to 50,000, 100,000? I mean, how many people are theoretically going to be at a crypto conference? This might be the peak of the mania. And, we've got the government in here. We got the vice president was here. Donald Trump as a candidate spoke at the conference last year, but now we got all these senators, and we got state governments buying Bitcoin, the government buying Bitcoin. To me, it seems like that's the end of it. You've got the corporations that got in, government got in, but why are the governments in? They're in because they've been bought and paid for by the special interests. The politicians are seeking votes, and they're seeking campaign donations. And so they're pandering to the Bitcoin special interest, which is now large enough to bribe these politicians. But again, that's more of an indication that, this is a peak rather than, the ground floor of something. We're near the end of something.
Michael Turpin was here. He's the Bitcoin OG. And he said only 5% of the world owns Bitcoin. Isn't that pretty early?
That's a lot. That is a lot of people. You get 5% of the people to own anything. I mean, first of all, how many people are in Africa, right? There's a lot of people that are just not going to own it, right? How many people in China? 1.5 billion, 1.8 billion, 1 billion people in India. You really think all those people are going to own Bitcoin? Half the people who own Bitcoin live in America. What does that tell you, right? There's a lot of Americans who own Bitcoin. And why do they own Bitcoin? Do they need it? Do they use it as a medium of exchange? No, they're just gambling with it. They're buying it because they think they're going to get rich. You're never going to have 100% market penetration, right? But pretty much everybody knows about Bitcoin. Even the people who don't own it know about it. Right? When I first learned about it, hardly anybody knew about it, right? So I guess at that point, it was early. I just didn't believe it could ever become what it became. But yeah, when I first heard about it, hardly anybody knew what it was. So that was early. But now there's hardly anybody who doesn't know what Bitcoin is. And the fact that there are a lot of people that don't own Bitcoin, despite knowing about it, that tells you that they don't believe in it. Why would somebody who knows about Bitcoin and who has chosen not to buy it over the last few years, why would they decide to buy it a year from now, 2 years from now? They didn't want to buy it today. What's going to change? The only thing that could change is the price. Maybe the price will go up, but maybe it'll go down. So I think we have pretty deep penetration into the market. Can it go to 6% of the world? I guess, but maybe this is the peak or close enough to it. Because if you look at Bitcoin's peak price in 2021, right, and I think peaks are significant. So look at the last peak from that period. The price of Bitcoin was about 69,000 at that peak, almost 70,000. And now it's, north of 100,000, about 108,000, something like that. But if you price Bitcoin in gold, which is probably the fairest way to price it rather than any fiat currencies, especially if they claim that it's digital gold, right? So they're trying to compare Bitcoin to gold. They make it look like gold when they depict it. It's a coin with a golden color. But if you price Bitcoin in gold, despite all the hype, right, all the the political backing and all the NFTs and the strategic reserves and all this, Bitcoin today, as we're at this conference, is about 10% lower than it was at its peak in 2021, priced in gold. So why is that? Why hasn't it gone up? So maybe it's peaked. Maybe it peaked in 2021 and we kind of double topped around now, and the next big move is down.
But everybody in the world has heard gold. Does that mean gold peaked?
No, because gold's not a mania. Gold's not a bubble. Gold's just been around for thousands of years. And, gold is gold. Gold doesn't really change. What changes is the value of fiat currencies. How much, of a currency do you need to buy gold? And when we had a stable monetary system that was, there was no central bank while we were on, gold was our money. The price was constant. When the first Coinage Act in 1789 defined a dollar as a weight of gold. And basically, an ounce of gold was $20. That's what it was. $20, was 1 ounce. And when we created the Federal Reserve in 1913, it was still $20 an ounce. And it stayed 20 until 1933 when Roosevelt devalued. And now you needed $35 to buy an ounce of gold. So the dollar was now worth less gold than it was before Roosevelt devalued. And it stayed $35 an ounce until Richard Nixon was president. And he devalued the dollar a couple of times. And he left it at $42.22 or something like that. And then we said, okay, forget it. We're off. The dollar is no longer defined by gold. The dollar is not worth its weight in gold. It's just worth whatever somebody will pay for it. It's just free floating fiat currency. No longer has any tangible backing to it. And ever since then, you've need more and more dollars to buy an ounce of gold. Now you need $3,300 to buy an ounce of gold. But gold hasn't changed. It's the same ounce of gold. What's changed is the purchasing power of the dollar, fiat Federal Reserve note. And that's going to continue. I mean, we have massive deficits that are only going to get bigger, not smaller. For all the political hype of Doge, the Republican big, beautiful bill takes a debt problem and makes it worse. The deficits that were already big will be bigger as a result of this bill than they would have been had they never passed it.
Why?
Well, because they have tax cuts and spending increases beyond what was already scheduled. And so there's bigger deficits, so there's more money printing, and so dollars are going to lose value, and you're going to need more dollars to buy the ounce of gold. But I'd say that the entire move, probably over the last year and a half, where gold's gone from about 2,000 to 3,300, 50% increase in the price of gold, has happened with very little public interest. The public has not been buying gold. They've been buying Bitcoin, right, instead of gold. The buyers have been mainly central banks, foreign central banks, who I think are a lot more sophisticated than the typical Bitcoin buyer. And I think that they're buying gold because they're selling dollars and they're looking for a diversification from their reserves. And I think they recognize that the dollar's value is going to decline, that its days as the reserve currency are numbered. They're not over yet, but they're coming to an end. And so they're preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer, the center of global monetary system. And so if you're going to replace your dollars, what are you going to replace it with? You're going to buy euros, you're going to buy yen, you're going to buy pounds. I mean, all those currencies have their own issues. I think the most likely alternative for central banks to hold is gold. And so they've been buying, and I think they're going to continue to buy, regardless of price. But at some point, I think the public is going to wake up to what the central banks are doing and join in. And so that's going to send the gold price up even higher when now you have, private investors, both retail and institutional, competing with central banks to buy a scarce quantity of gold. And eventually, I think a lot of the people at this Bitcoin conference will be trying to buy gold too. And maybe they'll be trying to cash in their Bitcoin to buy gold. But, when a significant number of people want to sell their Bitcoin, the problem is there's nobody to buy it.
Is that why you're here to convert the Bitcoiners into the gold people?
Well, I'm hoping to talk some sense into these people. But the problem is we're in this echo chamber.
Right.
And people are saying, how can all 30,000 of us are right and you're wrong, right? Well, because it's a Bitcoin conference, right? I mean, if it was an idiot conference, right? Yes, all the idiots would be wrong. And if I showed up at an idiot conference, not being an idiot myself, right? So it's not a random sample of people that happen to be at this Bitcoin conference. I'm the only one here that doesn't like Bitcoin.
What led us up to now? I mean, you brought up the gold standard. Okay, why do you think Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard? There's different theories. What's your take?
Well, the alternative, I guess, was political suicide. I mean, the problem was the government, mainly under, prior to Nixon coming on board, a lot of it was under Lyndon Johnson. But during the 1960s, you had, the war on poverty, Great Society, Vietnam, the moon mission. So we spent a lot of money, and we issued a lot of debt. We didn't have gold to back it up, right? And so we came to an inflection point where either we needed to deflate, devalue, or default. And so in order to devalue, or deflate rather, the bubble, we would have had to have prices coming way down to meet the gold price. Alternatively, we could massively devalue the dollar and make gold. Nixon tried devaluation, but it wasn't enough because he only devalued a little bit. But it would have been very politically embarrassing to substantially devalue the dollar. So they basically chose defaulting on the obligations. Remember, Federal Reserve notes were obligations to pay gold that we did not have, right? Because we created too many notes. It's like if you have a checking account and you write a bunch of checks, but that exceed your balance, right? These checks are going to bounce if any people try to cash them. And we had issued a lot more Federal Reserve notes than we had dollars to back them up because the Federal Reserve notes were IOUs for gold, right? That, people were loaning us their gold. And so rather than massive cuts to government spending that would have been required, a deflation of prices coming down, and defaults and bankruptcies, a lot of things would have had to happen. And Nixon took the easy way out. And, we did have a big inflation that followed. Anyway, we had a lot of inflation. That's why we had the price increases in the 1970s, because Nixon, made the choice that he did. And if you remember, or know about the 1970s, the dollar lost about 2/3 of its value versus the Deutschmark, the yen, the Swiss franc. But it lost even more relative to gold. And it went from $35 an ounce to $850. But oil prices went from $3 a barrel to $30 a barrel. It's a tenfold increase. But oil prices didn't really go up. The dollar went down. When we were giving OPEC $3 to buy a barrel of oil, we were giving them $3 that were backed by gold, that were redeemable in gold. But when we were giving them $30, we were just giving them paper. They couldn't get anything. So it was politically expedient for Richard Nixon to take that path.
Sure.
And unfortunately, that path became available to him in the Johnson administration because that's where they allowed, the president was given the authority to do that under Johnson. And in fact, my father is one of the few people who testified in front of the Senate Banking Committee against that. But, the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, the president, secretary of the treasury, they were all in favor of this. And my father said that if we go off the gold standard, it's going to lead to higher inflation, right? Gold prices are going to go up. And the Federal Reserve Chairman and the Secretary of Treasury said the opposite. They said that it was the dollar that was propping up gold. And if we went off the gold standard, the gold price would fall. That it was the dollar that was supporting gold. And that we would actually have lower inflation going off the gold standard. So, everything that the Federal Reserve Chairman and the Treasury Secretary Chairman said would happen was wrong. And my dad got everything right.
So why not put the dollar back on a commodity-based system? Bitcoin standard today. Bitcoin's capped, unlike gold, by the way. So, the idea of a Bitcoin standard,
the last thing we need is a Bitcoin standard, but we should go back to a gold standard. But
why not a Bitcoin standard?
Because Bitcoin is nothing. I mean, gold, you can't back nothing with nothing. You have to back nothing with something.
But there's a cap.
I don't care. There's a limited supply of nothing. But also, people focus on the 21 million number. Mm-hmm. What about the 2.1 quadrillion number? That's how many Satoshis there are. Because one Bitcoin is just an arbitrary bundle of 100 million Satoshis. So there's so many Satoshis out there. There's enough for every man, woman, and child on the planet to have hundreds of thousands of these things. But you can't do anything with a Satoshi. Just like you can't do anything with 100 million Satoshis. All you can do is give them to somebody else. But there's no real value there. It's not like an ounce of gold that has value because you can make stuff with it. You can do things with it. But the reason that politicians don't want to go back on a gold standard is for the same reason they went off it. Gold provides discipline to politicians. When you're on a gold standard, you can't promise something for nothing. You can't run $2-3 trillion a year deficits. You can't vote for tax cuts and lie to your constituents that you cut your taxes, right? You need to be honest. Gold is like a chaperone at the political prom, and the politicians don't want the chaperone. They don't want to act responsibly. They don't want to tell their voters they can't have this and they can't have that. We got to cut this and we got to cut that. And the people at the conference, Bitcoin people, they always think, the gold standard failed. And that's so gold doesn't work. The gold standard didn't fail. It worked perfectly. We failed as people to stay on the gold standard. We went off it when it became tough to stay on it. And that's not gold's fault. Had we, respected the gold standard, we would not be in the financial mess that we're in now. And just because, politicians had no stomach for a gold standard doesn't mean that they would have stomach for a Bitcoin standard either, even if you could implement one. People think, we're going to use Bitcoin because gold didn't work. Gold worked perfectly. That's why we got rid of it, because it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And so the same politicians who don't want a gold standard aren't going to want a Bitcoin standard. The reason you have politicians today that are advocating for Bitcoin is because they've been bought and paid for by the Bitcoin special interest groups.
Oh.
Bitcoin is now a large enough group that it has political muscle. The biggest donors in the last campaign cycle was crypto, more than the defense, more than the pharmaceutical companies. They bought political influence. And so now you have politicians who are pandering to that interest group because they want their money and they want their votes. And so it's now the most corrupt part, I think, of the American political system. The fact that politicians are selling out their country for the select interest of a group of Bitcoin holders who, want to make money off the government pumping up their tokens so they can sell their tokens to the public. And the public has no say in the matter. I mean, I don't want to buy Bitcoin. I've never bought Bitcoin. I mean, but now the government is going to take my money and buy Bitcoin.
They said they won't.
Well, if you look at the Loomis bill, right, where is the money going to come from? Well, they want to take the money that they get from the Federal Reserve every year and use that to buy Bitcoin. Well, but they should use that to pay down the debt. That's not free. We're going to take money that we would have got and we're going to use it to buy Bitcoin. But the other thing that Loomis wants us to do is she wants to mark to market the U.S. government's gold holdings, because it's still on the books at the $42, where Nixon left it, and wants to, revalue it to $3,000 an ounce, $3,300. which of course, makes no difference because nobody believes it's worth $42. But what she then wants is the Federal Reserve to take that new valuation, which would be, hundreds of billions of dollars, and print new money. Say, oh, because the US government has all this gold, we're going to print all this money and loan it to the Treasury, collateralized by this gold. And now she wants to take those newly printed dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, and buy Bitcoin with them. Now, that's not costless. That's massive inflation. You are inflating the money supply to buy Bitcoin. And all the people that sell the government their Bitcoin are now going to take that money and go shopping. And so bid up prices. And so the people who didn't have Bitcoin to sell to the government are now losers because now everything they want to buy is more expensive because all the people who had Bitcoin got all this extra cash from the government. So creating inflation to buy Bitcoin isn't costless to the public. There is a huge inflationary tax exacted from the public. But the winners are the Bitcoin lobby that now gets to sell their Bitcoin to the government strategic reserve. But the country loses. And meanwhile, all of the money now that has been misdirected to Bitcoin, look at all these companies now that are being formed, Bitcoin treasury companies, right? What do these companies do? They buy Bitcoin. What value does that add to the US economy? Nothing. No goods are produced, no services are provided. They just raise all this money and go out and buy Bitcoin with it. And then they borrow money and buy more Bitcoin. And they issue stock and buy Bitcoin, right? This is all a big, pyramid of a Ponzi. And meanwhile, the Chinese are building factories and making stuff. And Trump says he wants us to be more self-reliant. He wants us to produce more. Well, how are we going to produce more stuff if we're creating meme coins, right? So the government is misallocating and misdirecting resources and capital where it shouldn't be. Because if it wasn't for all this government crypto support, this wouldn't be happening.
Can we say we like gold, but it's just a new generation prefers Bitcoin? It's not a either gold or Bitcoin type of debate. It could be, I like gold, but we prefer Bitcoin.
Yeah, they prefer it because they don't really understand it. I mean, people are young. And when you're young, you're very idealistic. You don't have the wisdom that comes with age. And so a lot of young people think they know a lot more than their parents and their grandparents. But, I think that there is a sexy story to Bitcoin. And the fact that, there is all this technology behind it that's appealing to people. But I think the main appeal is the get rich quick scheme. I think people are interested in Bitcoin because they've been told that they're going to get rich if they buy it. And if they don't buy it, they're going to be poor. That is the selling point, the FOMO. You have to buy this. It's almost like, with college degrees. So many Americans were told you need to get a college degree because if you don't, your life is ruined. Right? They used to say, if you don't get a college degree, you're going to have to cook French fries for a living. And now they say, if you want to cook French fries, you got to go get a college degree, right? Because everybody's got these degrees because they were scared that if they didn't get one, their life was over. And it's kind of a similar thing with Bitcoin. Have fun staying poor if you don't buy it, and you can never sell your Bitcoin. That's the other thing. Like you just have to buy it and pretend you don't own it because you can't. You have to just hodl it forever and never sell it. And the people who want you to never sell your Bitcoin are the people who are selling you their Bitcoin, right? Because somebody is selling, because otherwise there wouldn't be any Bitcoin to buy. So I think kids have been misled, and they're young, they're ignorant, they're greedy, they're easily influenced by this. But what I think ultimately the young people will come to realize or come to prefer is you can have the functionality of Bitcoin with gold, except better, cheaper, and faster. Because anybody can custody gold, and if you want to tokenize it and issue tokens that represent ownership of that gold, you can buy the token, which means you own the gold, but you can transact in the token. So I can send tokens or receive tokens, and I can buy goods and services or get paid for providing services or producing goods. I can be paid in gold. I can price my products in gold. And we can transact with each other instantaneously using our cell phones or text messaging. And the gold doesn't have to go anywhere. The gold just sits in a vault and acts as a basis for all these transactions. But now I'm using real money. And gold is a store of value, but it's also a medium of exchange and a unit of account. Bitcoin is not a store of value because it doesn't have value to store, but it's a lousy medium of exchange because it's slow and expensive. And it's not a good unit of account because of it's too volatile. But gold works as money. Tokenized gold works even better. Just like, the initial banks that issued paper currency, that was to make it easier to transact in gold because the paper currency was backed by and redeemable in gold. But instead of carrying my gold around, I carried paper around. But all those bills represented IOUs for gold. My gold was safely stored with a blacksmith or then with a bank. And they gave me pieces of paper that represented ownership of that gold that I could use in commerce. Well, now we don't have to issue paper that's backed by gold. We can issue digital tokens. And now I can transfer those tokens to you using the internet, and I can transfer them halfway across the world instantly for next to nothing. So we can have digital gold, real gold digitized. Bitcoin is not digital gold, it's digital fool's gold.
But I just feel like whatever you described, Bitcoin can do better. Because if you put gold in vaults, then there's third-party risk. If you look at Bitcoin, there is a cap, but gold has no cap.
Right, but gold is very scarce, and there's not a lot of gold. The supply of gold grows by maybe 1% to 2% a year, which is about the growth of the world's population. So gold is a very, very scarce asset. But not only is it scarce, it's extremely valuable because of the properties that it has that make it unique. Bitcoin may be scarce, and if you think about it as 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis, doesn't sound that scarce. But even if you just look at the number of Bitcoin, right, the units of Satoshis, 21 million, it could be scarce, but it doesn't have value. It doesn't have a use like gold does. And so just because something is scarce doesn't mean it's going to be valuable. You have to be valuable and scarce. And I think Bitcoin is actually neither because there are lots of other tokens. There's tens of thousands of tokens. Now there's all these meme coins. And in each meme coin is scarce, right? There's a cap, right, on the number there are. But they all compete with one another. Gold doesn't compete with all the other metals. I mean, sometimes you can substitute, you could use silver instead of gold, or maybe platinum, or maybe you can use copper, but there's a very limited number of metals. But for certain things, you need gold. The other metals won't work. But there's no limit to the number of tokens that we could use. You don't have to use Bitcoin. Just because Bitcoin was first, just because Bitcoin is the biggest today, doesn't mean it's going to be the biggest tomorrow. People's change and people invent a better mousetrap. And as far as custodians, yes, you do need a custodian with gold, but there's never going to be a single custodian. There's multiple custodians, and they all compete with one another for safety. Brinks has been around for about 150 years as a custodian of gold. They've never lost an ounce. Nobody who has entrusted their gold to Brinks has ever lost any money. Now, maybe there was some robberies, but you know what Brinks did? They made everybody whole because they wanted to protect their value of their brand, of their reputation. And in capitalism, third parties compete for reputation. That's why insurance works, right? People buy life insurance, they buy auto insurance, they buy health insurance, they buy fire insurance. All of that is third parties. And so you have to trust that the third party is going to pay your claim when you submit one. And so it's not like third-party custodians don't work. They work very well in a free market. And so the same thing would be true for custodians of gold. Right? The thing with Bitcoin, and the reason Bitcoin doesn't require a custodian is because Bitcoin is nothing. And so to custody something requires a custodian. I don't need a custodian to custody nothing. right? But I don't want to put my faith in nothing, right? People say, I don't want to have to trust a custodian to hold my gold. All right, well, I'm only going to use custodians that I trust, and I'm not going to just use one custodian. I'm going to spread my gold around. So if one guy screws me, somebody else won't. And in fact, I'm going to self-custody some of my gold, right? Keep it myself. But with Bitcoin, you could say, okay, I don't want to trust a custodian, but what are you trusting? I am trusting that the public continues to ascribe value to nothing, right? You have to trust that this mass delusion continues and that people are going to want your Bitcoin. What if they don't want it anymore? Right? And it's not like people haven't had their Bitcoin stolen or lost. I mean, the minute you put your Bitcoin on an exchange, right, it could be hacked, it could be stolen. There's all kinds of scams people have lost. I had some Bitcoin that I lost, right? I didn't buy it, I got it for free, but I didn't have my password. And then, that was it.
By the way, you put your address on Twitter. How many people actually donated to that address?
Oh, that's a new address. So what I did there, so the initial idea that Trump floated for the strategic reserve was that if he can get Bitcoin in a net revenue neutral way that had no cost to the taxpayer, they would get it. And so I thought that was funny that people were celebrating this because it was really a hollow victory at the time. And I said, okay, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to establish my Bitcoin strategic reserve.
Okay.
I'm going to model it on the government's. And that if I can accumulate Bitcoin at no cost to myself, then I'm willing to do it.
Right.
And so I didn't know how do I get Bitcoin without any cost? Well, people have to give it to me. So I gave people my address and I said, this is my strategic reserve. You want to help me fund it? And I got some Bitcoin, not a lot, But initially people thought that I was taking it because they saw the Bitcoin go in and then it went out. And that's because I had an exchange wallet on Coinbase. Mm-hmm. So then I opened up a hard wallet and I moved all that Bitcoin from the exchange wallet to a hard wallet. Mm-hmm. And now I put that address. That way people can see it at all times. And so anybody that wants to look up the address can look it up and they can see that the Bitcoin is there.
I see.
And I've told people that if you do put Bitcoin into my strategic reserve, I am not going to use it. I'm going to leave it there until it's worthless. But I'm going to be a good Bitcoin hodler and never sell, and I'm going to hodl to zero. But I also want to use my Bitcoin reserve as an example of why you shouldn't have a Bitcoin reserve. But so far it hasn't worked because it's gone up. Because most of the Bitcoin I think was put in there, 90,000-ish. And so now it's, over 100,000.
I secretly think you're a Bitcoiner.
Well, I was a Bitcoiner before other people knew what Bitcoin was, but only because they've, redefined a Bitcoiner to being like a gold bug, right? But,
explain that difference.
Well, look, when I was on my panel today with Natalie Brunell, and she said, hey, we all believe in sound money. And the first thing I said is, well, some of us believe in sound money and some of us think they believe in sound money because people now ascribe all of the characteristics to gold to Bitcoin. And they say Bitcoin is actually better than gold. It's gold 2.0. So a lot of the people that buy Bitcoin today are buying Bitcoin for the reasons that I bought gold and for the reasons that I still buy gold and that I recommend that other people buy gold. But I think that they're wrong to think that Bitcoin is digital gold. And the market will tell you that that's not the case. If you look at the way Bitcoin and gold trade, they tend to trade in opposite directions. The correlation between Bitcoin and gold is negative. Now, over a longer period of time, yes, Bitcoin has been going up and gold has been going up, but so have stocks and so have a lot of things. But if you look at the short-term correlation, like day to day, right? If gold is up, chances are Bitcoin is down. And if Bitcoin is down, chances are gold is up. Bitcoin trades with a high correlation with risk assets, like tech stocks and the NASDAQ. So when the NASDAQ is up big, Bitcoin is usually up big. The NASDAQ is down big, Bitcoin is down big. Usually it's down more and it's up more. Gold typically rises when the stock market falls and when Bitcoin falls. And when Bitcoin and the stock market are going up, then that's when gold is going down. So Bitcoin to me is the anti-gold. And so I don't see how it could be digital gold when it's the opposite of gold. If it was digital gold, it should at least be positively correlated with gold. And in the real world, Bitcoin can't replace gold in for anything. I mean, I have a gold watch, right? I got a gold bracelet. I can't make this bracelet out of Bitcoin instead of gold, right? I can't substitute Bitcoin for gold in consumer electronics or in aerospace or in medicine or in dentistry, or in any one of the numerous uses. Gold is the most useful metal on the periodic table. But in no circumstance can I choose to use Bitcoin instead of gold, because it won't work, right? So Bitcoin is nothing like gold in the real world, and it's nothing like gold in the financial world. It's the opposite of gold in the financial world. So by what definition is it digital gold? Because someone decided to represent it as a coin and make it gold in color, even though it's just a string of numbers, unrelated, just random string of numbers. So I just think it's Bitcoin is a collectible token that's got nothing to do with gold. People collect Bitcoin, and they collect Bitcoin for the same reason that a lot of people collected Beanie Babies. They think that their collections are going to be more valuable. They think more people are going to want to collect Bitcoin in the future, and that their Bitcoin collections will go up. But I don't think it has anything in common with gold. I mean, the story, they try to make it act like gold. That's how they represent it. They say, hey, it's portable, it's divisible, it's fungible. Yes, it's all those things, and gold is those things too. But just because they've replicated some of those qualities doesn't mean that they've turned Bitcoin into gold, right? It's just fool's gold. And unfortunately, a lot of people have bought into that myth.
If I'm from this A country and I'm in US now, A country is all of a sudden someone attacks A country. I know my seed phrase, so I have my asset with me. But I don't have gold, or I can't carry gold bars.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, you can, because you can have a lot of value in gold. I mean, this bracelet here is probably about $20,000 worth of gold. It's melted down.
But what about the Bitcoin here?
What if you forget it? I mean, my memory is starting to go as you get older. You can't remember. I gotta write my seed phrase down. I mean, what if I lose it? I mean, so you can forget that stuff. But if you had, tokenized gold, right? And it's the same thing, right? You can leave, and in fact, you don't even have to remember your seed phrase, because if you can, let's say I'm the custodian of your gold, and you have to rush from one country and go to another country. If you prove to me who you are, I can give you your gold.
What if you're in that country?
What do you mean?
The custodian is in that country. Now what?
Well, you can have a custodian who's not in that country. If you're in a country that's really, a little dicey, you'd probably want your custodian to be abroad, right? So you could do that. And, then your gold will be waiting for you when you get out of that oppressive country into the freer country. But yes, I mean, the idea that you can just remember your seed phrase, and you don't actually need to have anything. Yes, I mean, there's some interesting in that. But what if by the time you leave with your seed phrase, people have decided that they no longer value Bitcoin? And yes, you've got your Bitcoin, but it doesn't really have any market value anymore, because the world decided that, we were stupid to believe in this, and we don't believe in it anymore. Because, what happens with the dynamic of any kind of pyramid or chain letter or Ponzi, you've got all these people that are accumulating and hodling their Bitcoin, and they're not spending it, right? And the reason they're not spending it is because they're afraid of missing out on future gains. And hey, yes, if I buy myself a car today for $30,000 worth of Bitcoin, that car could end up costing me $3 million, because the Bitcoin I sold to buy that car would have been worth $3 million. So I'm not going to buy that car. I'm going to get by with my old car, or I'm going to use a bicycle or whatever. But people are holding off on cashing in their Bitcoin because they're afraid of missing out on the future gains. But when we get to a point where enough people believe that, it's high enough. I'm tired of waiting for a car. I got to get a car. This bicycle is no good. I can't take a date out on the back seat of my bicycle. I got to get a car. And more of these people decide they want to spend. Well, now what happens? Now people are selling their Bitcoin, and so the price is going down. Because if I want to buy a car, the car dealership's not looking for Bitcoin. They want dollars or they want euros or pounds, wherever you happen to live. And so now people start selling, and now the price starts going down. And if it continues to go down, now people are like, you know what? I got to get rid of my Bitcoin, because if I keep holding it, it's going to be worth less. So now the whole game changes and it turns around. But things go down a lot faster than they go up. And Bitcoin went up pretty fast, so it can go down a lot faster as the air comes out of the bubble, and everybody is rushing to salvage what they've got before it's nothing. Right? So that will eventually happen. There'll be a rush for the exit.
Give us a price prediction for Bitcoin then before it goes to nothing.
If I could tell you that, right? If I knew how high Bitcoin was going to go, I would buy it, right? If I knew.
Well,
right?
I remember
then I would sell it when it got to that price.
I remember I asked you this question a couple of years ago. I said, look, if I were to tell you with certainty, I mean, maybe I'm a time traveler, whatever, that Bitcoin's going to 100K, eventually it did. Would you buy back then? I think the round was, at the time, it was maybe less than 20K when you and I spoke about this. And you still said, no, 100K worth of nothing is still nothing.
No, I wouldn't have said, I probably wouldn't have believed you were a time traveler.
Sure.
But, but assuming you could convince me that you were, in fact, a time traveler.
Fine.
Right? And I knew for a fact that Bitcoin was going to hit 100,000, of course I would buy it at 20,000. In fact, if you were a time traveler today and you told me that Bitcoin was going to hit 1 million,
or anything,
you'd have to tell me by when.
Yeah.
And also you'd have to tell me how much is a cup of coffee going to cost. I want to know, because if there's hyperinflation, I could lose money on $1 million Bitcoin. Sure. It might not keep up. But if you gave me the facts, yeah, sure, of course. But the reason I can't buy Bitcoin is because I have no idea when this bubble is going to pop. See, it's easy to buy it if you believe in it. If you don't think it's a bubble, well, sure, just buy it. But if you know it's a bubble, it's much harder to say, because people tell me, well, yes, it's a bubble and people are dumb enough to buy it and they're probably going to keep buying it and it's going to go even higher. So why don't you just buy it now to make money off of all these idiots who keep buying Bitcoin? And the problem is, I don't know when the idiots are going to stop buying. And every time I would not have the conviction to ride it down because I'd be afraid that it's going to keep falling. So you have to completely believe in it to be able to ride out the cycles. I don't believe in it, right? So how am I going to have any kind of conviction? I'd be scared the minute it went down. I wouldn't know where the peak was. And so I just have nothing to do with it. But I think at this point that people trying to convince me that, well, maybe it's going to go to 500,000, maybe it's going to go to 1 million. All right. But it's already 100,000. So 1 million is only 10x, which is not nothing. But I own a lot of stocks that I think can go up 10x or more. And so I'd rather gamble on those.
Yeah.
And I think there's a better chance that Bitcoin goes down by 90% than a lot of these. I don't think the stocks I'm buying are going to go down that much. I mean, sure. Yes. Buying Bitcoin at $1, $5, $10, $100 was a home run.
By the way, you own a lot of gold stocks, okay? And a lot of the miners that we spoke to, at this conference, their strategy is to mine Bitcoin and hodl it. Why aren't gold companies mining gold and hodling gold on the balance sheet?
A lot of them should be, I guess.
Do you think that should be the model?
Well, they got to pay their workers. They got to pay, if they borrowed money, they got to pay interest. So they have a lot of costs.
Right.
But I actually think what mining companies should be doing is buying back their stock more than just buying physical gold. Because I think in most cases, they're getting a better deal on the gold by buying back their stock because they're buying back their own gold that they haven't mined yet. But to the extent that gold companies, the big companies now, that have a lot of cash now on the books, yes, they might as well hold gold instead of all that cash. It would make more sense. Or they can pay dividends and the shareholders can buy physical gold if they want to. But the gold companies are in a business. They have a business. The business is mining and selling gold, but they already have tremendous gold in the ground. So they're not thinking of holding above ground gold on top of the gold that they already have. But I think gold stocks are great bargains.
Sure.
I mean, most of them, and that's why I own so much. And I recommend that people, we manage a gold fund. the Euro Pacific Gold Fund. We have separately managed accounts where we manage portfolios of gold stocks. And I think that for a speculative asset, and I'm not, saying that gold stocks aren't speculative. I mean, it's a very risky business, mining gold. But I think right now the risk reward is tremendously in favor of buying these stocks. Yes, you could lose money if I'm wrong, but the amount of money you can make if I'm right dwarfs it. And that's where I'd rather put risk capital rather than gambling on more fools bidding up Bitcoin. I'd rather just buy these mining stocks. Because any money I were to put into Bitcoin, if you say, hey, why don't you just throw 100 grand, $1 million at Bitcoin? Okay, well, that's another 100 grand or $1 million that I can invest in gold mining stocks or something else. And that's where I'd rather put my chips. I just think I get better odds, got more upside, I got less downside. Because I don't believe, is Bitcoin going to go to $20 million or these crazy numbers? I mean, to me, it seems impossible other than through hyperinflation, which, renders it, meaningless.
Yeah.
But in real terms, in purchasing power terms, and as I mentioned, Bitcoin is lower by 10% priced in gold than it was 3 years ago.
But that's the time frame you picked. What about long term?
But that is a long term, that's 3 years. But what
about 10 years, 20?
Well, I think Bitcoin could be a lot lower 20 years from now than it is today.
20 years ago.
No, but how do we, well, of course, that's when it started, right? Yeah, I mean, look, even if Bitcoin goes to 10,000, you could still go back to when it started and say it's been the best investment, even though almost everybody who owns it will be way down. And in fact, even if Bitcoin goes to 1,000, the return from a penny is incredible, right? So you can always go back to the first Bitcoin and talk about how it's the best performing asset. But the problem is very few people owned it then. I mean, even Michael Saylor with Strategy, his average cost is about $70,000 for the 40 billion he's got in Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin can easily go below $70,000. And in fact, I think MicroStrategy, if they had just bought gold instead of Bitcoin, the returns would be about the same. Except if he had bought gold, he could actually sell it without crashing the market. There's no way Strategy could sell that Bitcoin at a gain. If he tried to sell it, he'd end up losing money by the time he sold the last Bitcoin he had. So I just think it's, if you look back at the peak price from 2021, how do we know that that's really not the peak? I mean, we did get slightly above it after Trump won for a day or two, but barely. So how do you know we don't have a double top from 2021 and 2025? 2020. That's the double top, and maybe that's it. Maybe we're just distributing all the Bitcoin from strong hands to weak hands, and it's going down. I mean, if you think that we've peaked in the Nasdaq, if you think a lot of these tech stocks have peaked, Bitcoin is going to go down right along with them. I mean, it's highly correlated with that market.
I think we have time for one more question, Bonnie.
My last question is, what has to happen for you to start buying Bitcoin?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't bought it yet, and it's gone from practically nothing to 100,000. So if that hasn't convinced me, right, what's going to convince me?
Think of a scenario.
Look, I mean, when Bitcoin first came onto the scene, when it, all of a sudden it was like $1,000, it went up and people were talking about it. And this is what was it? 2017 or earlier than that, or 2013 or what? I forget when it was. 2014. But I remember a lot of companies started coming out. We're going to take Bitcoin. We're going to take Bitcoin. There was a whole rush of companies that said we're accepting Bitcoin. And of course, they were working with a company called BitPay. And I was one of the first people at Schiff Gold to use BitPay, where you can, take your Bitcoin and use BitPay. They sell the Bitcoin, get dollars, and then, pay for the gold, right? But a lot of companies, because all of a sudden people that had Bitcoin had money. And stores were like, hey, I want people to spend that money with me. And so they were currying favor with the Bitcoin community by saying, hey, you can take your Bitcoin and we'll take it. And of course, they weren't really taking Bitcoin. They were taking dollars, but they were partnering up with a company that would make it easy to sell your Bitcoin to get dollars to buy their products. Well, today, fewer companies are actually taking Bitcoin than were back then. Because they realized that nobody even wanted to use their Bitcoin.
Because we don't want to use the hard money. to
Well, you
purchase
think
things.
it's hard money, but you don't want to spend it because you think it's going to go up. But it's also very expensive. The more people that try to use Bitcoin, the more expensive it is to use it. And so they say, oh, hey, you could use your Bitcoin to buy a cup of coffee. No, you can't, because the transaction costs are higher than the cup of coffee. And by the time, the merchant gets your Bitcoin, your coffee's cold, right? Because it takes so long to pay for it. But on the same token, right, I can tokenize gold, and you can buy a cup of coffee instantly and cheaply and pay for it with gold tokens. So, gold would work as a medium of exchange.
Wait, so going back to the question, so if more merchants accepted Bitcoin, you would buy it? Is that where you're going?
No, it's because no merchants really accept it because they just work with BitPay. But look, I suppose what everybody is saying is one day we're going to wake up in hyper Bitcoinization, and Bitcoin is going to be money. There won't be any more dollars or any more euros or any more yen. That everywhere I go, the prices are going to be in Bitcoin. The insurance is going to be in Bitcoin. Bonds are going to be in Bitcoin. Like, it's going to be a Bitcoin world, and Bitcoin is money. I guess if I wake up in that world, I'd have to admit that I was wrong. And that, I just don't believe that that's ever going to happen, because we're no closer to that now than we were 10 years ago. The only thing that's changed about Bitcoin is more people are gambling with it, right? So you have more people speculating in Bitcoin, but they're not using it. And in fact, fewer people are using it. They'll even acknowledge that if you actually want to use it, there are much better tokens. Like if you want privacy, use Monero, right? Bitcoin doesn't really give you much privacy, but there are other tokens. What people say now is Bitcoin isn't for using, it's for holding. Like they say it's like gold. You don't do anything with it, except they forget that you do a lot with gold, right? But they've reinvented Bitcoin as digital gold because you can't use it for anything else. So they pretend that it's just like gold because gold has no use. And some of the most foolish things that I've ever heard said about gold are from Bitcoiners, right? Because they have to pretend that gold has no value to ascribe value to Bitcoin. Because they say, well, gold is used for nothing, so it's okay for Bitcoin to be used for nothing, when gold isn't used for nothing. And they always say, well, there's so much gold, there's asteroids around the world that are made out of gold, all this nonsense. And then, they just last week, I think there was news, somebody was, they were able to turn lead into gold with a superconductor, a collider. And they said, you see? And I said, yes, you're right. And in 1 billion years of constant running, you can get 1 ounce. Who knows how much that's going to cost in energy to run this collider for 1 billion years to get 1 ounce of gold?
Sure.
The Earth won't even be here by the time you get that ounce.
So money has to be scarce, and it has to be used to be valuable. Bitcoin is scarce, but it's not.
Well, Bitcoin is scarce in a limited sense that we have artificially imposed a limit on the supply.
Right.
Gold is scarce by nature. Right. I mean, and so there's just a limited amount of it in the universe. But yes, you have to be scarce, but you have to have value. I mean, remember, money is the most marketable commodity. Money replaced barter. And so what money allows us to do is I don't have to have a confluence of needs. A butcher doesn't need to find a candlestick maker that wants his meat.
Right.
And the candlestick maker doesn't need to find a butcher who wants their candles, right? They trade gold. But if I'm a butcher and the candlestick maker gives me gold, I've received a valuable commodity in exchange for my meat.
Sure.
I've got gold that can be made into jewelry, that can be used in consumer electronics. I've got another good, right? So I get, if I work and my employer pays me in gold, I exchange my labor that has value and he gave me gold that has value. But Bitcoin has no value. Right? So there is no real transaction with Bitcoin on the other side of it, because Bitcoin hasn't given you anything, because Bitcoin isn't a commodity that has value on its own. So it's not money. At best, Bitcoin is currency, which is a money substitute. But what kind of currency is it? It's a fiat currency. So it's a fiat digital currency. It's the opposite of what the Bitcoin community claims to be against.
Well, that was a great talk. Enjoy the rest of your week at the world's largest nothing conference. We'll look forward to Bitcoin going to zero. Thanks, Peter.
All right, David. Thanks.
Thank
you. All right. Bye-bye.